Welcome to this week's edition of Focus on Connecticut. I'm Tom Appleby, and our guest is the congressman from the 4th District here in southwestern Connecticut, Jim Himes, Democrat. Good to have you with us.
Great to be back, Tom.
You know, we're taping this program Friday morning, and we were concerned you might not be able to make it, that there might be some action in Washington that we're all eager to hear about, and unfortunately, we're glad to have you, but unfortunately there isn't going to be any change in regards to the sequester. So we've got a half hour. You could tell us all about the sequester, what it's going to mean for us.
What a wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Tom. Well, yeah, so today, of course, is the first day of the sequester. The sequester, as most people know, being Latin for really dumb cuts. This was never designed to be a mechanism to put us on a sustainable path. It was designed to be a hammer over the head of the Congress to get the big deal done, which puts the country on a sustainable path, right? Well, that deal has not yet been done. Good news is the President is meeting with the congressional leadership today, and they will hopefully start a process of getting us to that deal, because over time, it's going to take a few weeks, but over time, the cuts, and these are across-the-board cuts, to Homeland Security, to education funding, are going to become, at best, an inconvenience to a lot of people in this country.
So the President and the leadership are going to meet this afternoon, meaning this is airing this weekend, but Friday afternoon. Why couldn't this be done weeks ago? Normally, when you have issues facing you in a family, in a business, in a government, people deal with things in a timely manner.
Right, right. And it is embarrassing for me to say this, but the Congress today acts when there is a sense of crisis. And you're right. Look, in a perfect world, and I've been calling for this for 3 years, 3 years ago, we would have done the big balance deal. It would have had cuts. It would have had adjustments to our health care system. It would have had some additional revenue, what we call the big balance deal. It would have gotten done. And you know what? Today we'd be talking about energy policy or about education or some of the things that we should be talking about. But instead, it requires a sense of crisis to bring the players to the table to finally get the deal done. We've seen it time and again in the last couple of years. It's the threat of a debt downgrade or the threat of a government shutdown which finally gets the deal done. And unfortunately, that's still the dynamic.
So these cuts that are going to take place over time, as you mentioned, when do we start to feel them?
Well, very soon, very soon. The President has been outlining how they hit. People who are getting unemployment checks, those checks are going to be a little bit smaller. Schools that are relying on federal aid for special education. The defense industry, which of course is important to Connecticut, is going to need to slow down their work and could conceivably be furloughing workers. This is not a government shutdown, but it is a dialing back of the services that the government provides. And that's going to become, as I said, at a minimum, an inconvenience. And what's even more frightening, I happen to believe that in the next, let's call it 4 to 8 weeks, a deal will materialize. If it doesn't, the economists are clear as a bell on this. If it doesn't, the furloughs and all of the associated cuts are going to damage this economic recovery. Estimates range between 700,000 and 2 million jobs that, if this thing really takes hold over a period of time, could be lost. That would be just the ultimate in self-inflicted wounds.
There is a sense that I think that the American people have at this point, that there's such dysfunction, such lack of communication or agreement or hail fellow well met attitude, whatever you want to call it, amongst lawmakers, that at this point there's just no way it's going to go away. This is just the way it's going to be.
In the 4 years I've been doing this, it has been an enormously polarized environment, very difficult to get things done. And, it reflects sentiment in the American people. I meet people every day who come up to me and say, cut the government, cut it dramatically. And then I meet the next person who says, don't cut anything else, raise revenue, make the wealthy pay their share. We've got differences of opinion in this country, which in the context of an economic meltdown have made it very difficult to govern. Not impossible, though. I mean, here as we sit on the first day of the sequester, there is some good news. Yesterday, the Violence Against Women Act was passed in strong bipartisan fashion in the House of Representatives. Not maybe of consequence like the big budget deal, but terribly important, of course, to the country's addressing domestic violence and that sort of thing. So, it's not that nothing happens, it's just that it's fairly painful to get things done.
There are those that say that passed, that legislation, only because Republicans are very concerned about their image with the American people on certain issues, and so they're reassessing it, and this was one of the ways to do it.
I think that that's right, and it is probably no coincidence that the other thing that is being discussed in a constructive way where we might get a deal done, of course, is comprehensive immigration reform. So you scratch your chin and say, violence against women and immigration reform, why is that? And of course the answer to that question is I think that the Republican Party, which in the House in particular has blocked just about everything in the last 2 years, has realized that they've developed that reputation and that they need to expand their appeal to women and minorities in this country in particular. So that opens up the door to doing some things as we did yesterday.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, the trap in Newtown may have opened the door for some changes in gun control. We'll talk about that right after this. Stay with us. Welcome back to Focus on Connecticut, talking with Congressman Himes. The assault weapons ban, you're on board with that?
Yeah, I am, as I am on board with the idea of limiting the number of bullets that can be in a magazine to 10, as I am on the question of universal background checks. You know, no matter who you are, no matter where you buy a gun, we check you out to make sure you're not a criminal. You know, I think this is a mixed story here. I do believe that Connecticut will get a good package of gun safety measures done.
Within the state.
Within the state, and I think that we will make a little bit of progress in Washington. I do not believe, I'm sorry to say, that an assault weapon ban is likely to pass in this Congress, but I do think you've got good bipartisan work happening right now on universal background checks, which, you know, if you asked me if I could only get one thing in this world of gun safety, I would say let's just make sure everybody who buys a gun, whether it's in a store, in a gun show, or over eBay, gets checked out to make sure they're not violent or a criminal or whatnot. And I think we may get that done in Washington.
There are those who are concerned that this is no matter what you're doing, it's a violation of my rights.
Well, it simply isn't. Look, I'm a supporter of Second Amendment rights. I enjoy shooting. But we have always regulated guns in this country. People say, well, you can't take away my assault right. Look, you can't have a machine gun. You can't have a tank. All the rights that we enjoy in this country are, to some extent, regulated. You have a right to free speech, but you do not have a right to go into a theater and shout fire. You will be arrested and prosecuted for doing that. So that's a silly argument. And look, I don't hear anybody out there saying what we really need to do is revoke Second Amendment rights. What they're saying is we've drawn the line in the wrong place. When a kid can use an assault weapon and a 30-round clip to murder 20 little kids, we have drawn the line in the wrong place. Let's make sure people have the right to have the shotguns and the appropriate weaponry that they need for hunting and self-protection, but stuff that is really designed for the military and designed, let's say, to kill a lot of people quickly, probably shouldn't be in civilian hands.
Let me shift gears entirely here. This week, the United States announced that it's coming out with support for Syria. No weapons involved in this one. It's going to be money. It's going to be aid, advisors. Is this the right direction for us to be taking?
I believe it is. I believe that we should, as we have, proceed enormously cautiously here for two reasons. One, the opposition in Syria is comprised, as it was in Libya, of some people who are genuine Democrats and want to overthrow a dictator and establish a more open and accountable state, and it's also comprised of some pretty tough characters who probably will never be our friends, as we learned in Libya. But the sooner we can bring that, or help bring that civil end, I mean 60,000 people dead already, the better it will be for the region. The other reason this is a little dicey, of course, is that what comes next. Syria is a very ethnically torn country, and so, you know, Egypt has been tough in terms of what happened after the dictator went down. Syria is likely to be even tougher.
So we've seen American efforts that are much more aggressive, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that appears not to have been the way. This is another approach. Should we just step back and say, you know, there's really no answer to this, so let them work their own problems out?
Again, it's a balance. It's no coincidence that the kind of care, the president is sometimes accused of leading from behind. I will tell you that I think my constituents would have zero interest in Iraq or an Afghanistan-like commitment of military troops to Egypt, to Libya, to Syria. I don't think anybody regards our incursion into those two countries as a model of success. So the government is being very, very cautious about this, and I think rightly so. Look, liberation movements, independence movements, including our own 240 years ago, are tough. They're brutal. And they, at the end of the day, must be led by the people themselves, as they were. Look, we had help 240 years ago but from the French. But, our forefathers fought a bloody and difficult independence movement, and that's what needs to happen in these countries.
In the case of the United States, though, we feel the good guys won. We're not so sure about that happening in any of these countries.
Well, no, we're not. And the fact of the matter is that over the next 20, 30, 40 years in places like Egypt and Libya and Syria, people are going to come to power, as they have in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood, that we're not going to like. But the fact of the matter is, in the long run, we are a country that believes that power comes from the citizenry, and there are implications to that, including that democracy is messy and we're not going to always like the outcome of a democratic system. Bear in mind that the evolution to democracy in these countries is going to be a 1 or 2 generation affair, not a year, not 2 years, and it is going to be a bumpy road. But in the long run, accountable governments, more democratic governments, are very much in our interest.
We're going to take another break. When we come back, let's talk about government accountability in the areas what we've been talking about, our involvement in Afghanistan. There's a big controversy over our use of drones and who's responsible and who has say over those people. And we'll talk about that because you're going to be involved in that in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to Focus on Connecticut. I'm Tom Appleby, and we're talking with Congressman Jim Himes, Democrat from the 4th District. You've been appointed in the last few weeks, I guess, to the Intelligence Committee, overseeing, among other things, among many things, the budget certainly of intelligence agencies, but this issue of drones and a very successful use of them in many ways, according to the Obama administration. There are those who are saying, but wait a minute, you're making decisions here that violate U.S. law.
Yeah, so the drone issue is an interesting and a complicated one, because that technology and what we've been able to do has decimated the upper ranks of Al-Qaeda, which is a good thing for this country, but it does provoke questions. It provokes questions about collateral damage. The use of this technology, of course, makes us less popular in the areas that we use it, because, of course, it's a horrifying thing for villages to, hear them and see the results. And it also poses some very serious constitutional issues. The president believes that on his authority and his authority, he can use this technology to kill people, including, in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen. And that raises profound issues. My own opinion, Anwar al-Awlaki was an enemy of the United States, a very, very dangerous individual, and we're all better off with him gone. But, and I'm speaking for myself here, and I think a lot of people would have the same feeling, which is it's uncomfortable to think that the president, without oversight, whether it's judicial oversight or congressional oversight, but the president and his people can make a list and say these people are going away. They may be very, very bad people, but it is uncomfortable to think that there wouldn't be a court or a congressional committee or something just providing a check and balance to that very frightening power.
So will this be an issue before your committee?
Absolutely. Look, it's an issue before the American people. The only mechanism right now for oversight of that particular activity is the Congress. Here's an interesting thing. If the president wants to wire, one of his agencies wants to wiretap an American who's communicating with a Pakistani, you go to something called a FISA court. This is a secret court that operates in a very classified environment, and that court awards the right to wiretap that individual. But that process does not exist when the president decides that there's an individual who we are going to kill. That's an odd thing. So anyway, this is a very interesting issue that the intelligence committees will be very much involved in.
The Supreme Court this week ruled on a very similar issue of wiretapping American citizens talking overseas, and decided that it's something that's acceptable. Are you concerned about the erosion of our civil liberties?
Very much so. Very much so. Look, we saw during the Bush administration, I'm talking about the president, my concern with the current, having lethal power that is potentially, unchecked. In the Bush administration, they did do illegal wiretapping, and that is not acceptable. This country is a country of laws, and more than being a country of laws, we're a country of values. So we're going to need to lean in and be very aggressive in going after terrorists all over the world. But we cannot do that in a way that violates the law, the way the wiretaps in the Bush administration did, or frankly that violates our values. Torture. There was torture during the Bush administration, and that is just not consistent with the core values of who we think of ourselves as being as Americans.
We're going to take another break, and we'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. Just a few minutes left with Congressman Himes. There's a growing concern that America has lost its impetus, its leading edge, that there are countries that are passing us. We were the innovators. I was just down in Florida at the Edison and Ford estates. And you see, one man alone had more than 1,000 patents. What's happened to that kind of American is the concern. Do you share that, or do you think, well, no, this is a bad rap we're getting?
It's a great question that we don't talk nearly enough about, Tom. And look, we are still by far the largest, most powerful, most innovative economy on the planet. Google, Microsoft, biotechnology, Hollywood, Harvard, MIT, that is a huge economic engine. But more and more we will be in competition with the Koreas and the Chinas and the Germanys of the world. And so what we need to do, when we talk about jobs, when I say we, I mean politicians, when we talk about jobs, we need to acknowledge that if we're serious about jobs, not just tomorrow, but 5 and 10 years from now, we will be talking about having the very best educational system in the world, because innovation comes from people. And guess what? It's not nearly what it needs to be. We are now deep in the pack on math and science scores, high school graduation.
When you say that, you mean in comparison with other nations.
Exactly.
We are not number one by far.
We are not number one on high school graduations, on math and science scores, on patents, as you pointed out. It also means that we will be wise in doing what we've always done. I pull out my iPhone and as an example of how government can work with the private sector to create immense wealth. What's an iPhone? It's a semiconductor. It relies on GPS. It relies on the internet. All three of those things had an early venture capitalist named Uncle Sam in their development through DARPA and that sort of thing. We're in this fight now about should government be bigger or should it be smaller. Fair fight. But we ought to be thinking about, look at those successes. These things that created the iPhone, the government helping IBM, helping through DARPA to develop the internet. This is what we need to continue to do so that we remain the most innovative country in the world, and so that our kids are starting companies and developing iPhones and coming up with cures through biotechnology. If we don't focus more on that and less on the crisis of sequestration and whatnot, 10 years from now we will risk not being the most economically vital, the most job-producing economy in the world, and we can't let that happen.
One of the ways we managed to lead the world was to open our borders and bring all kinds of people in here who brought all kinds of skills. Should we be doing more of that?
We should absolutely be doing more of that. And, this is a bright spot. We talked about it a little earlier. Comprehensive immigration reform, part of that will hopefully be, Tom Friedman says it, if you come here and you get yourself a PhD in engineering or software developer or whatnot, we're going to staple a green card to your diploma, so that those people who come from all over the world to get that kind of education decide to start businesses and to innovate and to come right here in the United States.
So you say this will be wonderful, we should do it if we can get past these issues like sequestering. How do we get past that? What's going to change this nation's political focus?
I think we will continue to slowly make progress on the budget and the fiscal stuff. Look, we've over the last 2 years, we've identified $2.5 trillion over 10 years in cuts and additional revenue. So we're making some progress. It's messy as can be, but I think that will continue. And by the way, if we don't, at some point interest rates will go up, and we will, because when interest rates go up, our budget in the long run is unviable. So we'll get that done. Immigration, I actually think we will get done as well. We talked about this earlier. You know, I think it's particularly important to the Republican Party that they be seen as open to comprehensive immigration reform, and consequently, I do think we will get that done.
And tax increases?
Well, you know, the January deal, which got through again in a bipartisan way, involved an increase in rates on the very wealthiest people in this country. That's not going to happen again. But where you can find more revenue is you've got a tax code of thousands and thousands of pages filled with loopholes. Where you can find more revenue is, and by the way, in doing this, you can also simplify that code, that tax code, is by going after those loopholes and those deductions and whatnot that create such complexity, and which create a world where everybody has lobbyists in Washington, D.C. saying, I want this loophole and you need to make this loophole better. That's where we need to look at this point, to tax code reform.
Jim Hyman's running out of time. Thanks so much for coming down and talking with us. Thank you for joining us as well. Please stay tuned. The news.